Can a monster truly be destroyed? Or does it simply find a better host? What happens when the demon you are hunting is not lurking in the shadows of the jungle, but is already waiting deep inside your own fractured soul? 64, on a secluded island off the coast of Thailand, a horrifying fiend was unknowingly freed. It didn't need a sacrifice, it needed a vessel. And a police officer, obsessed with his own twisted form of justice, was unknowingly the perfect target. Once inside him, the fiend would turn him against his own blood, consuming his comrades, and then, most terrifyingly, setting its sights on his pregnant wife and unborn child. This is the descent into darkness. This is the chilling story known as Halabala. We begin our terrifying journey in media res. Police officer Dan lay, broken and bleeding, trapped deep within a dark, desolate mountain cave. He was writhing on the cold stone floor, gasping and convulsing in excruciating, unrelenting pain. He was vulnerable, and the jungle knew it. Suddenly, a strange, disembodied voice echoed maliciously through the cavern. The voice was mocking, cruel, and distinctly not human. It taunted Dan, reminding him that his wife, Vina, had already issued a stark warning. Yet, despite her desperate pleas, he had still recklessly come to this forbidden place. The voice sneered, pointing out the bullet wound that had brought Dan low, reducing him to this pathetic, desperate state. A chilling, cackling laugh followed, bouncing off the damp cave walls. Dan was utterly confused, desperately trying to locate the source of this unsettling sound. He scanned the darkness, but saw nothing. Then, his attention was drawn to his own hand, bound tightly with a piece of black fabric. As he tore the black cloth away, the sight that greeted him was absolutely shocking. He was struck dumb with horror. Imprinted onto his very flesh was the hideous, distorted face of a monster. This monstrous visage began to speak to him, demanding that he recall precisely how he had arrived at this terrifying place. The creature insisted that if Dan could remember, the two of them, the man and the fiend, could escape together. As the monster spoke, the scene dissolved, plunging us back into the recent past, revealing the tragic prelude to this nightmare. We witnessed Dan in a happier time with his wife, Vina. Vina was visibly pregnant, and they were a couple deeply in love, counting the days until their child's arrival. Their focus was entirely on the future and the joy of welcoming their daughter. But the fragile peace was instantly shattered by a ringing phone call from one of Dan's police colleagues. Upon answering, Dan learned that the dangerous fugitive they had been pursuing for weeks had finally been located. Dan immediately began preparing to rush out the door. This move sparked an intense conflict with Vina, who understood her husband's true nature as a law enforcement officer. She revealed that Dan was never satisfied with merely arresting suspects. His method was always the same. He preferred to conduct immediate encounters, effectively summary executions of suspects. This had been his brutal practice for years. Now, with Vina's pregnancy, she strictly forbade him from continuing this murderous approach. Dan, however, was resolute, justifying his actions as being for their daughter's future. He declared passionately that he would not allow their girl to be born into a world where human beasts reigned supreme. Vina countered, viewing his actions not as justice but as a great sin. Dan tried desperately to soothe her, promising that he wasn't doing anything wrong. But the story confirms Vina's worst fears. Dan was indeed a merciless and brutal man. He habitually subjected his detainees and suspects to horrific torture. On that ill-fated day, he was hunting a known gang member, the brother of the notorious criminal boss, Tab. Dan pursued the young man into a dark alleyway, cutting off any path to escape. The cornered criminal knew exactly who Dan was. Aware of the police officer's chilling record of over 100 encounter killings, the suspect was certain Dan was about to execute him. In his final moments, the criminal taunted Dan, threatening him with the wrath of his older brother, Tab. He promised Dan that if he died here, Tab would track him down. Dan dismissed the threat, reminding the man that Tab was currently serving time in prison. The suspect scoffed, revealing the arrogance of a career criminal. He boasted that escaping jail was trivial for a man like Tab. He promised that when Tab learned of his younger brother's death, his first act would be to wipe out Dan's entire family. He chillingly detailed his revenge, torturing and murdering everyone: Dan's wife, his sister, anyone he cared about, before finally killing Dan himself. As these venomous words were exchanged, an innocent observer watched the scene unfolding. A tiny girl peeked out from behind a sheet metal partition. At that crucial moment, a bee landed on the shoulder of the suspect. The man instinctively raised his hand to brush the insect away. Dan instantly misread the movement, believing the man was drawing a hidden weapon. Dan reacted instantly, fatally shooting the suspect. It was yet another encounter killing. However, the tragedy did not stop there. The bullet that killed the suspect ricocheted, or perhaps traveled, hitting the little girl watching from the other side of the partition, striking her head. The innocent child died instantly. The public outcry over such a monstrous error was unavoidable. To contain the scandal, Dan was transferred far away, banished to a remote, mountainous region of Thailand named Halabala. The consequences of his violence followed him immediately. Vina was fiercely angry over the death of the innocent child. She refused to speak properly to Dan. She was consumed by the terrifying premonition that Dan's great sin would bring a terrible disaster down upon them all, especially in her vulnerable, pregnant state. Dan was also internally devastated by the events, though he rigidly suppressed his emotions, refusing to show his distress to anyone. They were assigned quarters in a police outpost deep within the jungle mountains of Halabala. As they tried to set up their temporary home, the atmosphere was suffocating. Vina remained silent, refusing to engage. She stood motionless, repeatedly clanking the knives in the kitchen. The constant, jarring sound of metal on metal eventually pushed Dan past his breaking point. He snapped, ordering Vina to stop the noise immediately. Vina's subsequent behavior was utterly chilling. She adopted a strange, creepy demeanor and demanded that Dan abandon his police career entirely and flee Halabala. She argued vehemently that their lives were no longer just their own. Their daughter was coming soon, and they had to return to Bangkok. He needed to find a safe, new job. Dan tried to reason with her, asking for time to think. He explained that he intended to solve a major case here, hoping it would expedite his transfer back to a better, safer city post. Hearing his ambition, Vina began to laugh, a sharp, unsettling sound that held no humor. She grabbed a knife, holding the sharp blade directly against her pregnant abdomen. She chillingly suggested that perhaps she should simply end everything right then and there. Dan was overcome with fear at her disturbing display. He frantically screamed at her to stop. It was the sound of Vina calling his name that yanked Dan back to consciousness. He realized that the entire terrifying episode, Vina's eerie laughter, the knife threat, had likely been a terrible nightmare, or perhaps a vivid hallucination. Maybe it was a spiritual warning, a sign from nature itself, urging him to leave the area before it was too late. Meanwhile, miles away, the narrative shifts to a stark gray prison cafeteria. Inmates were having their lunch. Among them was Tab, the ruthless gangster, and the brother of the man Dan had executed. Tab was not eating, he was executing a meticulous plan. As the guards watched, Tab suddenly plunged a metal fork deep into his own stomach. He was severely injured and immediately rushed to the hospital, while being transported via an elevator between different hospital units. A quick-thinking police officer noticed something crucial. Tab's handcuffs were dangling open. Before the officer could raise the alarm, Tab moved with savage speed, attacking the guard. Tab bit the officer near the neck, killing him instantly in a visceral spray of blood. Using the deceased officer's firearm, Tab swiftly executed the two remaining police escorts. It was shockingly clear that Tab was operating on a different level. Despite the severe, self-inflicted wound to his abdomen, his strength was incredible. His organized network of associates was already in place to aid his escape. Tab easily slipped out of the hospital undetected, commandeered a vehicle, and fled Bangkok. Later that night, back in Halabala, Don and Vina were ripped from their sleep by a sudden, forceful knocking on the door. Both were immediately filled with a sense of dread. Coming to a strange, new, isolated place, only to be greeted by a midnight visitor, was deeply unsettling. When Dan finally opened the door, he found one of his colleagues waiting. The man insisted he needed to speak with Dan privately. The news was dire. Tab had successfully escaped. The colleague revealed Tab's ultimate goal, using an ancient, little-known route to escape across the border into Malaysia. Once Tab reached Malaysian territory, he would be untouchable, forever evading justice and punishment. This news, however, excited Dan. For Dan, this was the last possible chance to deliver the punishment he felt Tab deserved. Furthermore, as if fate itself were intervening, the escape route Tab was using went directly through Dan's new jurisdiction, Halabala. Dan was thrilled. Despite the horrific consequences of his previous encounter and his recent transfer, Dan was still utterly consumed by his mission and refused to stop. This unwavering obsession finally broke Vina. She was overcome with frustration and repeatedly demanded to know where Dan was going. Dan initially tried to evade her questions. When her anger escalated, he finally confessed. He had to go deep into the jungle. A dangerous criminal was escaping along that route, and Dan simply could not allow him to get away. Vina pleaded with him, begging him not to go. Dan tried to appeal to her practical side, promising that solving this case successfully would be the only way they could quickly secure a transfer back to Bangkok. But Vina was no longer worried about their living situation. She felt a powerful, visceral certainty that terrible danger was looming over them. While she had always supported his work, this time, an overwhelming fear paralyzed her. She implored him to stay. Realizing her pleas were useless, Vina resignedly reached into her bag. She handed him his prescription medication. She made him swear a solemn oath that he would keep his promise and return to her within 3 days. Don took the oath and immediately left. Dan drove straight to the Halabala police station. His partner, Toss, met him, immediately pointing out a major problem. They had no official warrant to arrest Tab. Toss stressed that if they waited for authorization, Tab would certainly reach Malaysia. Dan, driven by a dangerous self-assurance, grabbed a random notice, folded it, and presented it to the assembled officers, brazenly claiming this piece of paper was their official arrest warrant. Since he was their senior officer and spoke with such authority, no one dared to question his reckless disregard for procedure. The Halabala police station rarely handled serious cases. The officers spent most of their time idly relaxing, but they tensed up noticeably when Dan announced their destination. They had to go to Batu Village. It was a forbidden village. Sensing their sudden terror, Dan pressed them for details about the area. They nervously explained that Batu Village, hidden deep in the dense jungle, was once inhabited by man-eaters. These savages were worshippers of an ancient, horrific fiend or demon named Bataiya. The officers swore that the terrifying presence of Bataiya still resided within that village and dominated the surrounding jungle. Dan quickly dismissed their fears. He told them that if they were afraid of dying, they were in the wrong profession. He reminded them that he was a family man with a pregnant wife facing the imminent birth of his child, yet he was still willing to risk everything to capture a criminal. However, one officer raised a practical concern. They absolutely needed a hunter. Only a professional hunter could navigate the treacherous jungle island and lead them to the forgotten Batu Village. The consensus was that no hunter would willingly take them into that cursed place. If you are finding this descent into madness gripping, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We uncover chilling stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Just then, another officer spoke up, claiming he knew an elderly hunter named Ro who might be convinced to join them. However, Ro was currently locked away in jail. They arranged for Ro's release. Initially, the old hunter appeared pathetic, frail, and weak. He was subservient, holding his hands together and begging them for forgiveness. Then, in a sudden, disturbing shift, the three police officers seized Ro and forcibly made him drink alcohol. The liquor instantly changed the old man. Ro's demeanor transformed into something frightening. He began to laugh wildly, menacingly. He stared at them and asked if their purpose in going into the jungle was simply to die. Ro promised that if they truly desired to see a living hell, he would lead them there. With that ominous declaration, Ro led the expedition. As they departed, he began to narrate the dark history of Batu Village. He explained that it was situated within a mangrove forest, home to wild, man-eating people. These inhabitants were physically and behaviorally distinct from other humans. They were the devoted followers of the demon Bataiya. These cannibals would abduct people from nearby communities. They would consume the victims' entire bodies, leaving only the head, which they presented as a horrific offering to the fiend Bataiya. Eventually, the terrorized surrounding villages formed an alliance. They devised a coordinated attack. One night, they descended upon Batu Village. They dug a massive pit through all the villagers inside, and then burned them alive, obliterating the entire community. But Ro confirmed the fear that persisted among the locals. While the villagers were gone, Bataiya, the powerful fiend, was not. The entity still resided in the village, dominating the jungle. This is why the entire area remained strictly forbidden. The team traveled by boat until they reached the edge of the island. The moment they stepped ashore, Ro performed a strange ritual. He quickly planted a specialized stick into the earth and attempted to set it on fire. It refused to light. Ro understood this clear sign. The jungle itself was rejecting their entrance. He advised them to wait a few more days. Nature was signaling misfortune. Proceeding now would invite disaster. Dan, stubborn and focused only on his mission, refused to heed the warning. He forcefully demanded they move forward. Rowe fixed him with a deeply penetrating gaze. Rowe admitted that Dan might be able to defeat the monsters outside of him, but he asked Dan how he planned to stop the far more dangerous monster that was slowly growing savage inside his own heart. Rowe then pressed him further. Wasn't he thinking about Vina at all? Hearing Vina's name spoken by this strange old man startled Dan. How did Rowe know anything about his pregnant wife? However, Dan quickly dismissed the mystery, his focus fixed on Tab. Rowe begrudgingly conceded, agreeing to lead them into the interior. He established crucial rules for the final leg of the journey. Once they reached the precise designated location, Rowe would become completely silent. He would neither speak nor gesture. The only signal that his duty was complete would be a distinct whistle, after which he would leave immediately. Following a small, final ritual, they began their treacherous trek. Rowe warned them that the route he was taking was a shortcut, famously known as the Path of Death. Extreme caution was mandatory. They were explicitly told, if they heard something, they must pretend they did not hear it. If they saw something, they must pretend they did not see it. No spiritual entity or malevolent force could be allowed to realize they were being perceived or listened to. As they moved, Dan began to see unsettling things. He glimpsed a screaming child and a doll. These apparitions vanished instantly. Ignoring the spectral warnings, they pressed onward. As they continued, evening turned into the inky blackness of night. Rowe selected a place for them to rest. He carefully strung a specialized red thread around their designated perimeter. His final instruction was delivered with chilling severity. No matter what transpired, they absolutely must not step outside the red enclosure. To leave that bounded space meant certain death. As the words left his mouth, horrifying, unnatural shrieks erupted from the jungle surrounding them. The officers understood that they were in extreme danger. They settled down to rest within the boundary. Dan leaned against a massive tree and eventually succumbed to sleep. In the dead of night, Dan woke up suddenly. He heard unsettling noises emanating from the depths of the jungle. He looked around inside the red perimeter and was gripped by panic. His colleagues were gone. He frantically searched the immediate area, but they were nowhere to be found. Then he saw her. Deep within the shadows of the jungle, Vina stood, her arm outstretched, desperately pleading for his help. Driven by primal instinct, Dan started to cross the inviolable red thread. Just as he was about to step into the darkness, Rowe lunged forward, grabbing Dan's leg. The shock pulled Dan back to reality. He saw his colleagues right where they should be, sleeping peacefully inside the perimeter. The horrifying vision of Vina had been nothing more than a trickier psychological ploy engineered by the fiend. Shaken, Dan slumped down next to Rowe, snatching the hunter's bottle of liquor and drinking deeply. Rowe took the bottle back. He confronted Dan, asking pointedly why he had come here if his love for Vina was so great. Why hadn't he simply listened to his wife's dire warnings? Dan finally broke, revealing the source of his brutal resolve. He told Rowe a devastating story from his childhood. His father had also been a police officer, a genuinely decent and ethical man. One day, Dan had a program at school, and his father promised to be there. His father never showed up. When Dan arrived back home, the street was swarming with police cars. Inside his house lay the bodies of 3 people, his father, his mother, and his grandmother. A man Dan's father had arrested a few months earlier had somehow been released on bail. That criminal, along with his gang, had come straight to Dan's home and executed his entire family. Dan was convinced that if he had been home that day, he would have been killed too. This trauma was the reason behind his violent philosophy. He refused to allow any criminal he arrested to survive and potentially seek revenge against his loved ones. Therefore, he simply executed every single one of them. Rowe listened intently. He noted that Dan had brought his sense of morality into the jungle. Rowe, he added, had brought his own. Now, they would simply wait and see whose morality would prevail in this cursed place. The next morning, the treacherous journey began again. As they walked, one of Dan's colleagues suddenly screamed, claiming he saw a figure dressed in white standing nearby. The panicked officer began firing his weapon wildly and ran toward the supposed figure. Rowe, unconcerned, continued to walk forward, never looking back. Dan's other colleague urged Dan to stick close to Rowe, while he would go after the panicked officer to see what had happened. We quickly learned the truth. The officer who had run away hadn't seen anyone at all. He was simply desperate to abandon the mission and return home. He hid himself from the group, planning to follow the trail they had taken back to civilization. A short distance later, Rowe stopped abruptly, sensing something powerful and ancient. He thrust his knife violently into the trunk of a massive tree beside them. Instantly, a violent gust of wind swept through the entire area. A terrible scream and the distinct sound of a rapid heartbeat echoed all around them. Blood began to seep profusely from the wounded tree. Rowe recognized the signs. They had arrived at the specified deadly location. He began to whistle loudly. His mission was complete. The atmosphere was deeply sinister. Blood-stained human skeletons were scattered everywhere on the ground. Meanwhile, the officer who tried to sneak away was swiftly intercepted by Tab. Tab, who had been shadowing them, ruthlessly used a wire to cut off the officer's breath, executing him right there. Tab was much closer than they realized. The second police officer, who had gone to search for the deserter, was now completely separated from the group. Desperate to find them, he encountered Rowe. He asked Rowe where Dan and the others were, but Rowe offered no verbal response. The hunter was silently chanting some kind of ritualistic prayer. The officer, running out of time and patience, rushed past Rowe and continued deeper into the jungle. Dan and his single remaining colleague pushed on with Rowe. They finally arrived at the abandoned Batu Village, moving slowly deeper into the heart of the cursed place. They reached the ancient sacrificial altar, the very site where the Batu villagers had been burned alive. As the three men surveyed the gruesome surroundings, a thin, bright red wire suddenly wrapped tightly around Dan's throat. Dan instantly realized Tab was nearby. But before Dan could react, the treacherous police officer, the one who had been working for Tab and deceiving them all along, killed Dan's last remaining loyal partner. The traitor cop then aimed his weapon to shoot Dan, but Dan's slain friend, in his dying moments, managed to shove the traitor into the massive, empty pit, beginning a desperate struggle. Dan, caught in the chaos, also tumbled into the massive pit. This was the same hole where the Manading villagers had met their fiery end. The impact of the fall instantly knocked Dan unconscious. He awoke some time later in the oppressive darkness of night. He noticed a ragged wound on his hand. To his utter bewilderment, several small teeth were embedded in the injury. He carefully picked the teeth out and wrapped the black cloth he had retrieved earlier around the wound. We, the viewers, noticed something truly disturbing. Dan had fresh blood smeared across his mouth. It looked precisely as if he had been drinking someone's blood. Dan, confused and unaware of the horrific events that had transpired while he was out, tried to find a way out of the pit. He discovered two previously unseen tunnels stretching into the subterranean darkness. Having no idea which path to take, he picked up a small rock, intending to throw it down one tunnel to test the distance. Before he could throw it, a profound sense of terror washed over him. He felt something terrifying was actively tracking him from inside the tunnel. The stone slipped from his grasp. A hideously violent shriek erupted from the dark passage. Terrified, Don abandoned the tunnels and ran back to the spot where he had fallen. Suddenly, a crippling headache slammed into him. Multiple voices screamed inside his head, calling him a fool and demanding to know why he hadn't obeyed Vina. This sensory overload transported him back to the very first scene of the story. He looked at his hand and tore off the cloth. The shocking, monstrous face had reformed on his flesh. The face spoke sinisterly. In a moment of sheer panic, Dan drew his knife and plunged it directly into the speaking face. The creature screamed in protest, begging him to stop, but Dan ignored it. As the blade pierced the image, the wound instantly vanished, normalizing his skin. Dan quickly swallowed the medication Vina had given him. He desperately hoped that his mind was simply fractured and that all of this was merely a mental breakdown, but his relief was momentary. In the next gruesome instant, the monstrous face reappeared, even more vivid and grotesque than before, now manifesting on his throat. The entity spoke directly to Dan from his neck. It taunted him, suggesting Dan secretly loved the brutal nature of his encounter killings. The voice declared that Dan was, in reality, nothing more than a murderer, cloaked in a police uniform. Dan weakly protested that he only delivered justice to criminals. The entity quickly crushed his defense, demanding to know what crime the small, innocent girl had committed before Dan's bullet ended her life. Dan argued it was an accident, but the face on his throat relentlessly provoked him. He couldn't use his knife this time. The blade was ineffective against the fiend's current location. In a final, desperate act of defiance, Don shut his eyes tightly and repeated the mantra, "It is only my imagination." Over and over, he whispered the words until, miraculously, the grotesque face vanished and his throat returned to normal. The narration abruptly cuts to a chilling nightmare. Dan saw himself eating peacefully with Vina. Vina leaned in, telling him she had chosen a beautiful name for their daughter. The name she chose was Bataiya, the name of the ancient jungle demon. Vina then erupted into a fit of horrifying, demonic laughter. This nightmare jolted Dan awake. He realized he was still in the cave, having dreamed the disturbing, psychological attack on Vina. The fiend was clearly intelligent, attacking Dan's deepest anxieties. Gathering his courage, Dan forced himself to stand before the frightening tunnel entrance. Immediately, the violent shrieks erupted again. But this time, Dan did not flinch or show any sign of fear or discomfort. Because he maintained his composure, the terrifying sounds instantly ceased. Suddenly, the horrific fiend appeared directly behind Dan. It began a relentless pursuit. Dan fled into the tunnel passage. The chase led him out into a body of water. He emerged, frantically looking for an escape, but the path ahead was blocked. He spotted a small, natural fissure in the rock formation and desperately tried to squeeze through it. He managed to wedge his body inside the narrow opening. At the same time, Ro, having left the cursed jungle, suddenly stopped. He sensed a major shift in the surrounding energy. He turned, took a long pull from his liquor bottle, seemingly acknowledging the terrifying completion of events. Meanwhile, Tab, with his remaining cohort, had successfully reached the ritual ground. Tab found a locket on the body of one of the slain police officers. He instantly recognized the symbol. This officer had been a secret worshipper of Bataiya. Tab surmised the truth. Bataiya required a sacrifice, a boli, to fully awaken. If the fiend was ready to let its own devotees die, it meant the ritual was nearing completion. Tab's associates started talking about the massive pit, but Tab ignored him. Tab suddenly grabbed the ceremonial Bataiya mask. It was a frightening artifact, lined with sharp nails. Tab violently forced the nail-lined mask onto his associate's face. The man died immediately. Tab had just made his second sacrifice to Bataiya. Since Bataiya demanded human heads, Tab then brutally decapitated his cohort. He appeared to find immense joy in this gruesome act, laughing and dancing. He tossed the headless corpse into the massive pit. Tab then completed the offering by beheading all the deceased police officers lying nearby and impaling their heads on the surrounding spikes. He threw their bodies into the pit as well. Immediately, the environment violently reacted. A powerful, terrible wind swept through the area. Ro arrived at that precise moment. He had been observing everything from the shadows. He slowly emerged and attacked Tab. Ro desperately tried to stop Tab from completing his horrific purpose. Tab had been trying to fully awaken Bataiya, and he was succeeding. Ro, undeterred, fought Tab with reckless abandon. Throughout the struggle, Tab was smiling. He was cheerfully sacrificing himself for the greater demonic plan. As Tab reached for a hidden gun, Ro shoved him backward, sending him tumbling into the ritual pit. As Tab fell, Ro heard the thunderous roar of the fiend, followed by the sickening sounds of something being consumed. Ro realized, with crushing certainty, that he was too late. Seconds later, Dan found himself standing miraculously above the pit. He was astonished to be out. His shock turned to horror as he saw the bloodied heads of his colleagues hanging on the spikes. He noticed that one spike remained empty. While staring at the macabre display, Ro attacked him. Dan tried to reason with the hunter, screaming, "It's me, I'm Dan." Ro stared into his eyes and declared the devastating truth. The creature had already entered Dan's body. Ro vowed that he would not permit the fiend to leave the confines of the jungle. Ro lunged to kill Dan. Dan quickly grabbed a weapon nearby and shot Ro directly in the throat. Ro collapsed, dying instantly. Dan then began to flee, desperate to escape this hellish place. But no matter how fast he ran or which path he took, he kept circling back, always finding himself at the exact same dreadful location. Dan was driven to the edge of madness. In a rage, he ran toward a body of water and suddenly stopped. He heard a sound. Instantly, Dan found himself inside a room filled with sacks. He heard Vina's voice calling to him from behind a door. He opened it and fell onto a bed. The next moment, he was back inside the dilapidated police station. On a flickering television, news reports slandered him. Then, just as quickly, he was back in the jungle. He looked down and saw Ro's lifeless body still lying there, next to a knife. He glanced repeatedly between Ro's corpse and the single empty spike. In a horrific blink of an eye, Ro's head was now hanging on that empty spike. The implication was devastating. The possessed Dan had decapitated Ro and completed the final sacrifice. The total number of sacrifices Bataiya required had finally been fulfilled. Only then was Dan able to escape the jungle's gravitational pull. He fled to the boat, managed to start the engine, and sped away toward his home. Back at Dan's house, Vina was experiencing her own terror. The local community had learned that Dan, a police officer, had killed an innocent child. They were violently angry, refusing to allow a killer cop to live among them. They hammered on the door, screaming. Vina was paralyzed with fear and refused to open it. The mob began pelting the house with rocks. Vina huddled inside, trembling and alone. Dan finally returned from the island. He drove his car straight to the house. The yard was deserted, the mob temporarily gone. Calling Vina's name, Dan was suddenly overcome with physical weakness. He collapsed onto the sofa, seemingly lost in a daze. Vina appeared and was stunned to see him. She rushed to him, embracing him tightly. Dan placed his head gently against her pregnant stomach, whispering to his child that he had returned. Utterly exhausted, he fell asleep in Vina's lap. As Vina affectionately ran her hand over his hair, she happened to glance at the nearby television screen. In the reflective glass, she saw a grotesque image. The man sleeping in her lap was not ordinary. The reflection confirmed her worst fear. The fiend had followed Dan home. Vina's blood ran cold. She tried to gently rise, but Dan shifted, sensing her movement. Vina instantly masked her panic, whispering that she needed to use the restroom. Dan, still exhausted, remained on the sofa. Vina was terrified, but carefully concealed her horror from him. She forced a small smile when he looked at her and then descended the stairs. She did not go to the bathroom. Instead, she slipped out the back door and scrambled into her car. As she frantically tried to start the ignition, the key slipped from her grasp. She reached down to retrieve it, and in that moment of vulnerability, the terrifying, demonic form Bataiya, inhabiting Dan's body, suddenly appeared and attacked her. Vina managed to crank the engine and slammed the accelerator. She drove desperately away, only to smash headlong into a large tree. The car was completely destroyed and useless. She stumbled out of the wreckage and saw the fiend already pursuing her. She fled into the jungle on foot, running for her life. She eventually found a garage. The main door was locked. She spotted some scaffolding nearby, granting her a dangerous route to climb onto the roof. Hiding up high while heavily pregnant was extremely difficult. The fiend spotted her. She heard its terrifying noises from below. Then, in a terrifying, splintering sound, the roof suddenly collapsed. Vina plummeted into the garage interior. Fortunately, she landed on the roof of a parked car, which cushioned her fall and saved her from serious injury. Painfully, Vina climbed down from the car and hid behind another vehicle. She saw the fiend's reflection in a car window. It had successfully entered the garage. Vina scrambled underneath the car. The fiend approached, standing right next to her hiding spot. She waited, barely breathing, until the coast was clear. She crawled out and attempted to open the car door, but it was locked. Vina realized she needed a distraction to find an unlocked vehicle. She grabbed a nearby object and threw it hard toward the far end of the garage, creating a loud noise. The fiend immediately moved toward the source of the sound. Vina seized the split-second opportunity and jumped inside a large parked van. She tried to remain perfectly silent and hidden. The fiend patrolled the interior of the garage, searching. Suddenly, her water broke. Her baby was coming. She clenched her teeth, trying desperately to suppress the agonizing pain. But the distinct sound of the water alerted the fiend. It moved toward the van. The demon in Dan's body advanced on Vina. In a final, desperate act, Vina grabbed a metal rod lying within reach and plunged it into the fiend's body. This pinned the demon to the van's interior. Vina quickly unlocked the back door and escaped. The fiend struggled violently, desperately trying to pull itself free. Vina held the door shut with her foot, using all her remaining strength. After violently striking the door several times, the fiend suddenly went still. A slow trickle of blood began to ooze from under the van. In that exact moment, Vina gave birth. In the chaos and fear of the garage, she delivered a daughter. The newborn's first cry jolted Dan back to consciousness. The blood they saw flowing from the van signified that the fiend was temporarily forced out of Dan's body. Dan realized the monster had been using his own form to attack Vina. He was stunned to find himself wounded inside the van. He painfully crawled out and saw Vina holding their tiny newborn daughter. He recognized his child. Vina, however, was still consumed by terror. Exhausted and weak, she repeatedly ordered Dan to stay away. Dan tried to reassure her, telling her he was her husband. When Vina finally recognized him, she whispered a crucial warning into his ear. If he was truly Dan, he needed to listen. Something terrible was inside him, and it had followed him home. Hearing this, Dan immediately wanted to run for help. Vina tried to stop him, but Dan insisted he would return swiftly with assistance. As Dan stood up to leave, he was violently flung back into a horrifying moment. He was back in the jungle pit. Tab was standing directly behind him. Tab smiled, chillingly thanking Dan for making his plan a success. Dan was utterly confused and tried to punch Tab. He was instantly back in his house, searching frantically for Vina. He went downstairs, only to hear Vina's voice from above. As he ascended the stairs, he was moving unnaturally, struggling to walk normally. Suddenly, he felt excruciatingly sick. A metal chain erupted from his mouth. When the chain fully emerged, Dan was paralyzed by horror. It was Vina's necklace, the one she always wore. Dan instantly understood the ultimate, devastating truth. The monster inside him had consumed Vina. Then a clump of hair came out of his mouth, followed by a locket. This was the locket Tab had worn. The realization crashed over him. The fiend had consumed Tab, too. A black liquid then spilled from his mouth. In the liquid's dark reflection, Dan saw not his own features, but the horrifying face of the monster. Dan was completely overcome by the entity possessing his body. He stumbled down to the kitchen, grabbing a knife, attempting to stab the fiend by plunging the blade into his own throat. But the fiend had achieved near total control of his body. It bent Dan's fingers, forcing the knife from his grip. A hideous, booming laugh filled the room. Dan writhed in agony, fighting the possession. His violent struggle triggered one final, clarifying flashback to the jungle pit. The moment Dan fell into the pit, his veins had immediately turned pitch black. This terrifying physical transformation, occurring just as Tab was completing his ritual, signaled that Bataiya was entering Dan's body. Tab had been praying for precisely this outcome. He had realized Bataiya chose Dan as its ultimate host. Tab knew that the complete spiritual corruption of Dan was the most extreme form of revenge possible. This explained why Tab had been smiling when Ro killed him. Tab confirmed, with his dying breath, that he had succeeded. Ro had been too late. Tab was pleased because more sacrifices were necessary to facilitate the possession. Unable to sacrifice himself, he had manipulated Ro into pushing him into the pit. Once Tab landed in the pit, the fiend Bataiya, now taking residence in, Dan immediately attacked him. This was exactly what Tab had wanted. He died ecstatic. This is why Dan woke up with blood on his face. He had already consumed Tab's sacrifice. Bataiya was now fully entrenched in Dan's body. Ro had realized this truth, which is why he had desperately tried to stop Dan. But the possessed Dan killed Ro and then hung Ro's head on the spike. Without those crucial sacrifices, Bataiya could never have left the jungle. Now, using Dan's body as a perfect vehicle, Bataiya had breached the boundaries and entered the world of ordinary humans. Dan was entirely erased. The demon, wearing Dan's skin, reached down and picked up the locket Tab had worn, a distinctive symbol used by Bataiya's devotees. He touched the locket to his forehead, then placed it around his neck. He looked directly into the camera, a sinister smile forming on Dan's face, and spoke Bataiya's full name. His eyes burned with a fierce, unnatural light. The question remains, why did Bataiya select Dan, out of all the victims and all the officers, as its host? The sources tell us that Dan himself was profoundly corrupted. While he wasn't accused of taking bribes or financial corruption, he was fundamentally corrupt in his methods. He believed in delivering punishment without due process or trial, regardless of guilt or innocence. He had killed numerous innocent people and was completely devoid of remorse. Dan possessed an inherent, dark, and devilish essence within his own soul. This inherent evil made him the optimal, irresistible vessel for the ancient fiend Bataiya. I hope you found this chilling tale compelling. Remember to drop a comment below if you think Vina can survive this impossible situation and protect her child from the evil that now wears her husband's face. Your support keeps these deep dive explanations coming. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel for more deep dive analyses of horror stories. The journey of the fiend mirrors a parasite that doesn't just feed on flesh, but on moral decay. It found the perfect environment to thrive, not in the deepest jungle, but in the heart of a man already rotten by his own violent choices.